Listen carefully. There are names buried so deep in American history that even the archives refuse to speak them out loud. This is one of those names. And once you hear it, you will never see power, obedience, or control the same way again. Somewhere beneath the polite language of ledgers and church records, beneath the myths of gentlemen planters and civilized order, there exists a story so precise in its cruelty that it feels engineered. Not chaos, not madness. Design. A system so confident in its permanence that it believed itself untouchable. And that belief became its fatal weakness. I'm not telling you a ghost story. I am not offering folklore to entertain you. What you're about to hear is more dangerous than superstition, because it exposes how domination truly works and how it can be reversed by someone patient enough to learn its rules better than its architects. In the Mississippi Delta, before the war that would later pretend to resolve everything, 9 men formed what they called a consortium. They did not call it evil. They called it efficiency. They met over brandy, spoke in numbers, and reduced human lives into columns and forecasts. They believed control was permanent because it was written down, because it was normalized, because everyone agreed not to look too closely. Into this machine was born a boy who was never meant to understand it. A boy legally classified as property, yet placed close enough to the machinery of domination to study it from inside. He learned early that power does not announce itself with rage. It whispers. It files paperwork. It smiles while it calculates. This boy watched bodies turn into resources. He watched intimacy converted into policy. He watched suffering disguised as management. And most importantly, he watched the men who did this convince themselves that intelligence below them was impossible, that awareness could not exist where chains existed. That assumption is the oldest mistake power ever makes, because systems of control do not fail when they are attacked from the outside. They fail when someone inside them stops believing the story they are told and starts reading the one written between the lines. What makes this story unsettling is not what was done to him. History is full of that. What makes it dangerous is what he did next. Not with violence, not with chaos, but with structure, with patience, with the same clinical logic that had been used against his people for generations. This is the story of Moses Jackson, and this is where the descent begins. To understand Moses Jackson, you must first understand the lie that sustained the world around him. The lie was not that slavery was brutal. Everyone knew that. The lie was that brutality required stupidity, that domination could only flow in one direction, that those reduced to numbers could never learn how the numbers worked. The Yazoo Delta was not chaos. It was order perfected, fertile land, predictable seasons, predictable violence. The 9 men who controlled that region believed themselves modern, progressive even. They spoke of agriculture the way later generations would speak of algorithms. Inputs and outputs, risk mitigation, optimization. They did not shout when they destroyed families. They documented it. And Moses grew up inside the documentation. His mother taught him to read in whispers by firelight, understanding that literacy was not knowledge, it was leverage. What she gave him was not rebellion. It was comprehension, the ability to see that every system reveals itself to those who observe long enough. As a child, Moses learned something most men never learn in a lifetime. Cruelty follows patterns. It repeats itself. It relies on routine, and routine creates blind spots. By the time he was assigned to clerical work, Moses was no longer just witnessing power. He was touching it, copying it, reproducing it word for word. The same handwriting that recorded cotton yields also recorded human pairings. The same ink that tracked profits tracked pregnancies. The same calm tone described both success and loss. What the owners never questioned was why a young enslaved man showed no visible reaction to this knowledge. They mistook his stillness for acceptance. In reality, stillness was discipline. Moses learned the schedules. He learned how often men disappeared into their comforts and how rarely they expected interruption. He learned which overseers could be predicted and which ones could be distracted. He learned how authority moves when it believes it is alone. Most importantly, he learned that power is lazy. Once it believes itself absolute, it stops guarding its edges. This is where most stories would turn toward escape. Flight, revolt, fire. That is not this story. Moses did not want to run from the system. He wanted to demonstrate it, to hold it up like a mirror and force its creators to see themselves reflected back, stripped of titles, stripped of distance, reduced to the same language they had used on others. What was forming inside Moses was not rage. Rage is noisy and short-lived. This was something colder, something instructional. He was not planning revenge. He was preparing a lesson. The moment that hardened Moses Jackson did not arrive with drama. It arrived with procedure. His mother, Esther, was no longer considered ideal by the consortium's metrics. Age had reduced her value in their calculations, but not eliminated it. They called it extended productivity, a phrase designed to erase the human cost of what it described. When she refused, the system responded exactly as it was designed to respond: swiftly, publicly, and without apology. The punishment was not just for her. It was for the audience. Control only works when it is witnessed. Moses was forced to watch because the system needed him to internalize the message. Intelligence did not grant immunity. Proximity to power did not grant mercy. Knowledge without obedience was still disobedience. 3 weeks later, Esther walked into the river. The ledger called it an accident. The ledger always called it an accident when responsibility would have required reflection. Moses copied the entry with perfect handwriting. This is where the transformation completed. Not into a monster, as lesser minds would frame it, but into something far more unsettling: a man who understood that the system did not fear suffering. It feared replication. When Moses asked to marry, the owners saw compliance, stability, a reinforcement of their worldview. They believed they were rewarding good behavior. What they were actually doing was expanding his access. Marriage allowed movement. Movement created visibility. Visibility created opportunity. Rachel became more than a wife. She became a vector. A reason Moses could move between plantations without suspicion. A reason messages could travel where overseers did not look. A reason routines could be mapped from the inside. For 2 years, nothing appeared to change. That was the brilliance of it. The system continued. The ledgers filled. The meetings occurred. The men drank and congratulated themselves on their own rationality. They never noticed that the same system they trusted had begun to speak a new language beneath the surface. A language of quiet coordination, of favors returned, of silences shared. The first disappearance shattered the illusion not because of violence, but because of precision. No ransom, no spectacle, just absence. A controlled removal followed by a return that left something broken behind the eyes. What terrified the consortium was not what had happened. It was that it had happened without chaos, without disorder, without an obvious enemy. They were experiencing something unfamiliar. They were no longer in control of the narrative. By the time the pattern emerged, it was too late to stop it. Each disappearance followed the same structure the consortium had used for years. Isolation, confinement, documentation, repetition. The men were not beaten. They were processed, treated as entries in a program that no longer belonged to them. And here's where you must pause, because this is the point in the descent where awareness becomes participation. If you're still listening, if you understand that systems survive by convincing their subjects they are natural, then mark this moment. Comment the phrase, "The ledger sees me twice." Not once, twice. This is not superstition. It is declaration. You are acknowledging that you see the structure beneath the story. Because what Moses did next was not about cruelty. It was about comprehension. The ledgers the owners were shown during their captivity were not threats. They were mirrors, written in the same clinical tone, the same measured language, the same reduction of identity into utility. Age, health, output, compliance. For the first time, the men who believed themselves architects of order were forced to experience what it meant to be categorized without consent, to be discussed without voice, to be scheduled without dignity. This was psychological warfare executed with bureaucratic elegance. And the most devastating element was this: no one could be punished. The law could not identify a culprit because it could not imagine one. Property did not conspire. Property did not plan. Property did not teach lessons. That assumption protected Moses better than any weapon. When the men returned, they did not speak because language would have collapsed the illusion that had governed their lives. To admit what had happened would have required admitting what they had done to others for decades. Silence became their prison. The system had not been destroyed. It had been exposed. And exposure is more destabilizing than rebellion. The descent was accelerating. The final meetings of the consortium were no longer about profit. They were about survival. Men who once debated yields now debated escape. Men who once trusted the permanence of their world now sensed its fragility. Not because of external pressure, but because the internal logic they had relied upon had been turned inward. This is the part history avoids, because it cannot be comfortably resolved. There was no uprising, no massacre, no heroic cavalry riding in. What followed was quiet unraveling. Programs halted, records altered, practices abandoned without explanation. The system did not, and it retreated, wounded, attempting to preserve itself by pretending nothing had happened. Moses Jackson did not give speeches. He did not claim victory. He understood something most men never grasp. True power does not announce itself when it wins. It simply stops needing permission. What happened to him afterward is deliberately unclear. Records thin. Mention fade. That is not coincidence. Institutions erase what threatens their mythology. But the lesson remains hidden in plain sight. Control systems depend on participation. They depend on belief. They depend on the assumption that those at the bottom cannot see the whole. Moses saw everything, and he proved something far more dangerous than revenge, that domination can be reversed not by force, but by understanding its machinery better than those who built it. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it, and the descent is not over. What unsettled the remaining masters was not fear in the ordinary sense. It was recognition. They had spent their lives believing control was external whips, laws, patrols, violence. Moses demonstrated that the real center of power was internal: perception, expectation, routine. Once those were compromised, the structure hollowed out from within. The men began to police themselves. Guards multiplied. Doors locked earlier. Conversations shortened. Suspicion crept into places where certainty once lived. The system had trained them to monitor bodies. Now they were monitoring thoughts. This is how psychological control collapses. Not through open rebellion, but through internal contradiction. Every institution depends on rituals to reassure itself. Meetings, records, protocols. When those rituals stop producing confidence and begin producing dread, authority becomes theater. The consortium continued to meet, but the tone shifted. Voices lowered. Decisions postponed. No one wanted to be the next name rewritten in that ledger. Moses remained exactly what he had always appeared to be: efficient, quiet, deferential. That was the final insult. Power expects resistance to be loud so it can crush it. Silence that understands is far more dangerous. What the owners never admitted, even to themselves, was that Moses had not introduced anything new into their world. He had simply removed the distance that protected them from their own methods. They were not being punished. They were being educated. This is the forbidden truth institutions work hardest to conceal. Systems of domination do not require hatred to function. They require participation, habit, the willingness of those inside them to stop asking what the system is actually doing. Moses asked nothing. He observed. As plantations quietly dismantled their most extreme practices, neighbors noticed the change, but not the cause. Reform without confession. Retreat without accountability. History would later credit economics, politics, inevitability. It would not credit a man who proved that mastery begins with understanding the rules better than the rule makers. That omission was intentional. Because if men like Moses Jackson are acknowledged, then the myth collapses. The myth that control flows only downward. The myth that intelligence belongs to rank. The myth that systems are neutral. They are not. They are designed. And anything designed can be reverse engineered. This is the knowledge that does not expire. You may be asking yourself why this story feels uncomfortably relevant. Why something buried in the 19th century feels like a warning written for now. It is because the machinery has not changed. Only the language has. Ledgers became databases. Breeding schedules became productivity metrics. Surveillance became optimization. The same clinical tone. The same reduction of human life into performance indicators. The same assumption that those inside the system cannot see beyond their assigned role. Moses Jackson understood something timeless. The most effective control systems do not rely on constant violence. They rely on normalization. When people accept the language of the system, they internalize its logic. They begin to manage themselves. That is the true inheritance of the consortium, not cotton, not land, but methodology. And here's where the story turns toward you. Every man who seeks mastery eventually encounters a choice. You can consume stories like this as entertainment, or you can treat them as instruction. Moses did not escape because escape would have left the system intact. He did not revolt because revolt would have justified retaliation. He studied. He waited. He mapped. He learned where power slept. Most men never do. Institutions survive by convincing you that resistance looks only one way. Loud, chaotic, self-destructive. Moses proved that the most destabilizing force is competence combined with patience. This is why his story is fragmented. Why it survives only in hints and absences. Because it does not flatter the narratives of either side. It does not offer clean heroes or redemptive conclusions. It offers strategy. And strategy is dangerous. If you're uncomfortable right now, that is appropriate. Discomfort is the signal that a belief has been challenged. The descent is not meant to comfort you. It is meant to sharpen you. Because once you understand that systems are maintained by belief as much as force, you begin to see them everywhere. And once you see them, you're no longer fully inside them. That awareness is irreversible. There is no monument to Moses Jackson, no official recognition, no chapter in standard textbooks. That silence is the final act of control. History prefers villains it can condemn and heroes it can sanitize. Moses was neither. He was a technician of power. What remains is not a moral lesson. It is a diagnostic one. Ask yourself this. Where in your world are ledgers being kept about you? Not literal books, but profiles, scores, classifications. Where are decisions being made about your value without your participation? Where has language been engineered to make domination sound reasonable? Moses did not destroy the system by attacking it. He destabilized it by making it self-aware. He forced its architects to experience their own logic without the insulation of privilege. That is why this knowledge is dangerous. Because it does not require permission. It does not require numbers. It requires understanding. The descent ends here, but the implication does not. Once you recognize that power fears comprehension more than rebellion, your relationship to authority changes. You stop reacting and start observing. You stop consuming narratives and start analyzing structures. That is the shift Moses embodied. History will tell you this story is an anomaly, an outlier, a curiosity. That is another lie. It is a pattern that repeats whenever someone inside a system learns to see it clearly and refuses to play the role assigned to them. You have now seen it. What you do with that awareness determines whether this was just another video or the moment you stop being managed by stories that were never written for your benefit. Dangerous knowledge does not shout. It waits. And now, it has been given to you.